Hey everybody, welcome to my talk, What You Can Be Excited About in Vue 3. Hey everyone, and welcome to my talk, What You Can Be Excited About in Vue 3. To tell you a little bit about me, here is me at Universal Studios, where I'm on the river adventure ride, which has this epic 85-foot drop. As you can see on the date below, this is prior to quarantine, and gosh, I miss adventure parks. And well, if you can't find me, I'm up here in the upper right, and if you couldn't tell, I am having an absolute blast. For those who don't know me, my name is Ben Hong, and I'm a Senior Developer Experience Engineer at Netlify. And if you're looking for me on the Internet of Things, you can find me under Ben Codezen. I'm also on the core team, where I work primarily on the docs team with my teammates Natalia, Sarah, and An, where we do our best work to try to make sure we bring you the best docs we possibly can. So, why are we here today? Well, in case you didn't know, Vue 3 was released recently. Naturally, some of you might be wondering what all the buzz is about, so let's go ahead and deep dive into some of the things that you can be excited about for Vue 3. The first thing I want to talk about is the bundle size. Vue 2 already is quite small, especially when gzipped. In fact, roughly around the same size as jQuery. So when we think about Vue 3, especially we're talking about what makes Vue 2 great and we're adding all these new features, it's kind of natural to expect that, well, maybe the package size is going to increase. After all, you're taking what makes Vue 2 great and adding a bunch of new things on top of it. Well, I'm happy to report that actually Vue 3, even though it has all these new features, was rewritten and has all these performance boosts that basically it is roughly the same size as Vue 2. And on top of that, because you can actually code split and the way the tree shaking works with packages, it actually has been rewritten in such a way that when you don't use certain aspects of the Vue package, it can actually be dropped and the bundle size can be made even smaller, making sure your applications are as performant as possible. Exciting stuff, right? The next piece I want to talk about is the improved TypeScript support. For those who don't know, Vue 3 was actually rewritten from the ground up entirely in TypeScript. This means that when it comes to developer tooling for making sure you have like type detection or just autofilling and documentation in things like Feature, now you're going to have better support. And on top of that, when it comes to integrating with libraries such as Vue Router, Vuex, and other ones that we built around Vue 3 in the future, you can also expect better TypeScript support, which is awesome. But most importantly, the key takeaway here that I want everyone to know is that TypeScript is still 100% opt-in. As we believe a lot in the Vue ecosystem, we want you to use what's best for you and your team. So if TypeScript is something you want to use, fantastic. We now have better TypeScript support. Otherwise, don't worry, nothing's changed. Next, I want to go ahead and talk about the reactivity system. We've improved the way things have been written with things like proxies that then allow us to do more intuitive things when it comes to coding in JavaScript. Let me give you a few examples. When it comes to arrays, in Vue 2, whenever we wanted to set a new array item, here we have a standard single file component where we have a data store that has an array defined on menu that we want to watch because after all we want it to be reactive. But when we wanted to update it and set an index with a different value, we would have to use Vue.set and then pass in the reactive data that we want to track, the index we want to update, and then the value we want to actually assign it to. Well, thankfully, in Vue 3, this is now no longer a restriction, and we can go ahead and write normal JavaScript as you would expect in terms of updating the array. So we just simply call the array this.menu, pass the index we want to update, and then assign it the new value. And Vue will go ahead and take care of everything and make sure it reacts as you expect. How about objects? Well, in Vue 2, we had a similar constraint where we have our menu here in this example that has an array of different menu items with their price, and we want to set a new property on this object. So we would use Vue.set and then give it the reactive object we want it to look at, assign it the property name, and then the value that it should be assigned, and then everything would work correctly. But again, this wasn't as great because this was new syntax that people had to learn and just frankly wasn't the most intuitive. Just like we saw in arrays, we can now use vanilla JavaScript to simply update the array object using dot syntax, or if we want to use the square bracket syntax. Either way, just using the JavaScript way, we'll update it and the reactivity system will take care of the rest. And the other example I'm going to give is deleting a property in an object in Vue 2, where we'd have to use the Vue.delete method, again, a specific method for updating whether or not we want to delete something for an object. And as you probably have followed at this point, you can now use normal JavaScript to use the delete keyword and simply delete the property that you want off of the object, which is awesome because as much as we can get back to vanilla JavaScript and less sort of magical syntax, the better it is for us as developers. The next feature I want to talk about is fragments. So what are fragments? Well, for those of us who have developed with Vue or frankly other frameworks for a while, we're all familiar with this error, which is that the template root requires exactly one element. Now this was a design constraint that a lot of frameworks had, and so oftentimes we found ourselves wrapping our component inside of a div in order to satisfy this one constraint so that this pesky little error would just disappear. However, this often led to our web app being polluted with divs everywhere, so not the best. Like, it was a compromise, but we didn't really love it. Well, thankfully in Vue 3, fragments, also known as multi-root components, is now completely viable. So now we can actually have our code look like this instead, no div wrapped, and this will be perfectly valid syntax. Another new feature coming in Vue 3 is the new teleport component. So what is the teleport component? Well, let's take a look at this code sample. On the left here, we have our index.html page where we have a standard HTML page with the head, the body, but inside of our body we have two different divs. We have our div ID app where you would typically expect our Vue app to go ahead and mount to, but then we have this other div ID modal where we actually want the content to render because this was probably where it makes more sense to belong as far as DOM structure goes. Now, in the lower right, we see that we have a modal.view component, and you see that there's this new built-in component that we have called teleport, which takes a prop of 2, and it assigns this whatever selector it is that where you want it to go. So in this case, we have this paragraph that says, excited for Vue 3, and we want it to do is, even though it's controlled inside the .view component, we want it to render in the ID modal. Well, with this new native teleport component, it'll do just exactly that. It's going to go ahead and take what's inside, which is our p tag excited for Vue 3, and then when it renders out to the user, it's actually going to go ahead and render out excited for Vue 3 inside of our ID modal, even though it's actually contained inside of our single file component, which is pretty great. Now, let's go ahead and talk about emitting events. This is a thing that a lot of us use in terms of Vue, but it was always a little bit lacking, and I'll explain why. One of the things I always loved about writing Vue components is that when it comes to detailing out props, there were basically a lot of built-in ways to document it in such a way that other developers would have an easier time understanding how the component was intended to be used as far as what props to pass, maybe what data structures, and then even a validator function to say what is a valid value versus not. But when it came to emitting events, well, this was a little bit trickier, because what you ended up having to do was you'd have to go around and you'd have to look inside of the template to see what method was being called, but then you might have to see what's emitted to then the emit name and then what's passed in. It's kind of a mess. And so we want to make sure that it's easier for people to develop things when it comes to Vue 3. So in Vue 3, there's going to be this new emit option on our component that's going to actually allow us to document the events being emitted inside the component just like we can document in props, which is pretty exciting because now all people have to do is go ahead and check out the emits block of a component and they can see, hey, all right, so we have a submit form here that it mainly checks the email, and if it's if it contains an email, great, we're going to go ahead and return true. Otherwise, it's not a valid event. And with that, we're going to have much happier developers because now you don't have to jump around a component trying to see how the event are emitted and the requirements and such. So as far as I'm concerned, the more documentation we can have for our components, the better. So very excited for this new feature. Now, of course, no Vue 3 talk would be complete without talking about the composition API. After all, this has been what a lot of the buzz has been about. So a couple things I want to highlight when it comes to the composition API is that, one, it is an advanced feature. So not something you need to get started with Vue or whatnot. For those of us who have used Vue for a while, when we first started, we often learned about props and things, but things like slots and even scope slots, those are things that we didn't, reach out for to learn how to use until we actually needed it, until there was a problem to solve. And I'd like you to think of the composition API in this way as well. And so in other words, it is an enhancement to the options API. And to squash any remaining rumors there are, the options API is not deprecated. We want you to use them in conjunction rather than saying pick one versus the other. That said, let's take a look at some code as far as what are the differences between the two. So what we have here is a simple options API component that sort of mimics the counter, but a much more simplistic version, where we have our data store that tracks count and currently has a value of 0, and then it renders it out on the page. Very simplistic. To the right here, here we have the equivalent. Basically we have the equivalent in the composition API as far as what we have on the left. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on here, because clearly there's more going on. The first thing you might notice is that we have this new setup called a lifecycle hook. And really what it does is allow you to basically define what sort of things will be used inside the component later on. So in this case, since you notice there's nothing else in the component, what we need to do in setup in order to achieve what we've achieved on the option API on the left is we actually need to set up this reactive data property called count. So the way we go ahead and do that is we return an object just as you actually do inside of your data function, and we basically say, what are we returning? So in this case, we're returning count, so that you see these two are equivalent. But of course you're wondering, okay, so where is this defined? If you go ahead and trace it backwards, we'll see that just using generic JavaScript, you define a constant called count, and what we've done is we have this new thing here called a ref. So ref here, basically think of reference. And what this is imported as a package from Vue, and what it does is it basically takes a basic data property and makes it reactive. So in this case, if we had just done const count equals 0, it would no longer be reactive, and so while we're returning a count to the component to use, it will never be updated in the event we have like an increment method or something. But by passing it to ref, as we see here, this will then make it reactive, so it will function exactly as we expect on the left. And so here it's just like a really quick overview on basically the composition API and the options API side by side. And so let's go ahead and just talk a bit about the pros and cons when it comes to using the composition API. Because after all, if we were to deep dive into like the various things you can do, that in itself is not only a whole talk, I could probably devote a whole workshop just to this alone. So when it comes to the pros of the composition API, there are a couple things to keep in mind. As we can see, the composition API really is a sort of a new paradigm for writing code. Because with the options API, we sort of have these predefined structures as far as data goes here, computed goes here, methods go here. You'll see that the more you work with the composition API, there's basically a lot more control and freedom, which is one of the benefits of it as well, because now you can sort of do things the way you might want to and how you might want to write it from a programmatic perspective. But then again, you start to move away from some of that structure that the options API provides. And as a result, for some people who are going to be using the composition API, you're going to end up with the ability ultimately to organize your code in more efficient ways, because now you can basically help to extract what you're doing in the setup function and share it amongst different components in a much cleaner way. Again, more details on that, I'm sure, in other talks that you'll see, and check out additional resources for that. There's a lot going on in the composition API, but Freedom and flexibility is certainly one of those things that a lot of people will definitely prize when it comes to the composition API. Now, when it comes to the cons, however, no technical stack whenever you're making a choice or like a decision, it's never 100% basically positive. Because as we saw before, like there is a higher learning curve. Because even just in the simple example I used of just like the count scenario, there are things you have to learn now about like ref. There's reactive. You have to learn about different properties that you're going to have to, like packages you'll have to import. Because frankly, composition API gives you freedom and control, but that means you got more to learn because frankly, there's a lot of things that make things work as you want. And the option API really does provide a lot of that syntactic sugar to make it easier for things to just work as you want. And so the higher learning curve is certainly something to keep in mind. As mentioned, when we compared the two, we saw that the composition API actually did have quite a bit more boiler code. So like when you just wanted a reactive property on the one component, it really doesn't make sense to use the composition API for something like that. And as people start using the composition API more, you'll see that it's more helpful when you have things that are either shared across various components, or it's really complex and you want to organize it in a very specific way. So keep that in mind, that just because there are a lot of freedom and flexibility with it, that doesn't necessarily mean basically you should rewrite everything with it. And as you might expect, what comes with freedom and control is that good software architecture is ultimately dependent on you and your team. So this means that whether you're coding things in a way that like making sure to avoid anti-patterns and things, like unfortunately that is now solely dependent on you. And that's something to keep in mind when using these things, so you avoid actually accidentally pre-optimizing or creating just situations that are difficult to work out of. And so I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I really want to drive the point here is that you may be tempted, or a team member, to rewrite everything using the composition API. After all, as developers, we love playing with the new shiny thing, and we want to practice it. But what I'm here to tell you is that please, please don't. And the reason why I say this is that while the composition API is a powerful and new technique that Vue developers really should have in their tool belt, remember that at the end of the day, all code is compromised. As I mentioned before, the Options API provides a lot of nice guardrails and structure, but it doesn't have the flexibility that the Composition API provides. And then flip side, Composition API provides a lot of flexibility and and lack of structure. But then, so you can like sort of do things according to what's best for your application. But then with freedom, that means you have to make decisions of like what's best, and it's just trickier. But again, it's all trade-offs. It's not necessarily bad or good to go one way or the other, but choosing the right approach for the problem you have is important, and that's something I want everyone to keep in mind. So, with that, I want to leave you with something that I'm personally really excited about that you probably haven't heard too much about. And that is the concept of state-driven CSS. So, what am I talking about? Well, here we have a stateful CSS button.view component where we can see here that we have a props that takes the color, and again, what we want is that the user to define whatever background color we want. So as you can see in the bottom, in the .custom button, we have a CSS variable for user color that has a predefined text value that is then passed into background color. And what we really want is for the props to define that, so we can then, if you can imagine as CSS gets more complex, that we can use that, and then it will populate everywhere exactly as we expect. Well, what we find is that we want it to pass down, and then what we want to do is we want to then swap out, right? So like this is in a perfect world. We would then say this.color, right? Because we're used to defining like the props this way. And then it's going to go ahead and pass down into our variable, just like that. Well, unfortunately, for those of us who might have tried this before, that doesn't work. Because after all, you're in a style block. You're not in the script block where there's this context and you can actually choose the props and those things. But I'm excited to say there's a new experimental feature coming along that is going to allow us to define variables inside of our style block that will then actually take the value from our script block. So you can see here that we have our color prop that passes down into our variables which then passes into our CSS variable for color, which then you can use throughout your CSS. So very exciting stuff, because by leveraging what's great about JavaScript in terms of, sort of controlling dynamic values and state, we then can leverage what's powerful about CSS as far as the cascade and the fact that it's able to share selectors and just pervade, this is just very exciting as someone who loves CSS and JavaScript, and being able to use both in their sort of native purposes and original design intent is just fantastic. All right, so we've covered a lot today, so let's go ahead and review what we've talked about. First, we've talked about the fact that Vue 3 bundle size is just as small as Vue 2 and can be even smaller with code splitting. We've talked about the fact that with Vue 3, it was rewritten entirely in TypeScript, so you're going to have better TypeScript support for tooling and libraries going forward. But remember, 100% opt-in, so don't worry if you don't want to use TypeScript. No big. And we have an improved reactivity system that allows us to write basically like code in regular JavaScript, and it works exactly as you want as far as updating arrays or objects. We even talked about fragments, aka multi-root nodes, which means we no longer have to worry about that message saying you have to wrap your component in a single element, which led us to polluted divs all over our web application. Of course, we also have the teleport feature, which will then allow us to then move content from one area where, again, it might make sense to control logic and pair them together from a developer perspective, but where it renders ultimately for users, it can then go ahead and render in the correct place, which is super exciting for us. We also have the emit component option, which will then allow us to better document how components work by telling developers what events are going to be emitted and basically declaring validator functions to let them know how the event actually works. And of course, we talked about the composition API and showed that it's incredibly powerful from allowing you flexibility to write things in normal JavaScript and basically organize things in the way you feel is best for you and or your application. But at the same time, it certainly has its drawbacks in terms of the higher learning curve, and basically it can be more boilerplate code in comparison to the options API if used in the incorrect context. Again, the key here is understanding where composition API can really help to solve a problem for you and not simply using it for the sake of using new technology. And finally, we talked about state-driven CSS and an experimental feature that hopefully will allow us to actually inject dynamic state properties into our CSS as variables so that we can then leverage CSS variables to do all the fun cascading things with CSS and make our app look awesome. And the truth is we've covered a lot here, but there is a lot more when it comes to what's new in Vue 3, and I haven't even covered all the experimental things either. So if you want to learn more about Vue 3, I highly recommend checking out the new docs for Vue 3 at v3.vue.js.org. Thank you everyone for watching this talk. If you're looking for me or want to continue this conversation, you can find me on Twitter at bencodezen, and just recently launched a YouTube channel, so if you want to check out more content or just learn more about what's going on, be sure to check me out at youtube.com/bencodezen. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you later.